Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is Tuesday, April the 15th, 2025, tax day. We're 100 days into the Trump administration, and when it comes to the scorecard on what some people might think of racial justice, things perhaps aren't very encouraging. Lots of headlines about this new administration's hostility to DEI, lots of attacks on important institutions when it comes to the African American community. The Smithsonian African American Museum in Washington, D.C. in particular seems to be under assault from the new administration. Donald Trump says it's sickening what they're doing, although some people might suggest that it's sickening what he's doing. And on the Doge front, the attack on the state might not be good also for advocates of one kind of racial justice or another. My guest today has a new book out today. Appropriately enough, it's called Black Power Scorecard, Measuring the Racial Gap and What We Can Do to Close It. It's by Andre M. Perry, who is a distinguished scholar at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow, and he's joining us from Brookings today. Andre, when did you write this book? I mean, if you were rewriting it today, might things be slightly different?
No, I wrote the book. It was inspired by the unrest in 2020, spurred by the killing of George Floyd. That's where the idea came from. Certainly, a lot of people had strong reactions to the phrase Black Lives Matter, both positive and negative reactions. But for me, I saw a research question. I saw the question of what are the most important factors on life expectancy for Black people? And the reason why I wanted to see a research question, so much of the movement during that time was focused on police brutality, and other issues that harm Black people. I actually wanted to take a different approach. I wanted to look at the factors that helps promote thriving. So, around 2022, my colleague Jonathan Rothwell and I, in partnership with the NAACP, we created what we call the Black Progress Index. And what that is an index that looks for the places with the highest life expectancy. We use the machine learning algorithm, Lasso, for those who are into statistics. We use Lasso regression. And what that does, it allows us to sift through dozens of databases to highlight the most important correlates, most significant correlates or predictors of life expectancy, and we landed on 13. But I started writing the book actually during the Biden administration, and I probably wouldn't change anything about the book, because some of the concerns that I had during the Biden administration, I had during the Trump administration, I had during the Obama administration, and administrations prior. I've always felt that, and I say this in the end of the introduction, that DEI and affirmative action have never been the goals. Um, Black Power has always sought out legislation that performs well for all Americans, including Black Americans. So Black people want housing policy to work for them. We want business policy to work for us. And so this book really wanted to prioritize a policy agenda around the factors that enable people to live long lives. And that's what we did.
Andre, you've identified the book as a kind of, so to speak, wonkish project, an attempt by a Brookings scholar to quantify the racial scorecard, the measuring the racial gap. Is that really ultimately what this is all about when it comes to racial justice in America? Can it all be quantified? Can it all be measured? Can it all be turned into data of one form or another?
Well, but I think the ultimate expression of power is being able to live a long, healthy life with dignity. And in that respect, you can measure power in years of life. And a lot of people will look at power as closing racial gaps. What we do in the Black Power Scorecard, we don't compare Black people to white people. We compare Black people to Black people across different places to see how they're living, and then look at the underlying factors that are correlated with life expectancy in places that perform well. And what we found, some of the factors will not surprise. Higher incomes, home ownership, cleaner air, stronger families, less crime. There are lots of different factors. And for me, I just want to make sure we prioritize around those things. What you will see in popular culture, and particularly in the various social media wars, are conversations around turning the Little Mermaid black, or how many Grammys Beyonce should win. I wanted to eliminate those, what I think are distractions from real policy. In addition, I do, if there's one critique I have of many of folks who are pursuing racial justice, is that we don't necessarily use data to our advantage, that we can actually use data to speak to everyday people and sort of identify the kitchen table issues. After this last election, you heard this conversation about the goals of progressives, where at least the language was too lofty. They really didn't resonate with everyday people. Well, we can actually use data to see what resonates with everyday people. And using this machine learning algorithm, we actually identified those factors that matter most for most people. So for me, I think you can measure a lot of it. There's certain moral, ethical, qualitative aspects of life. Certainly this doesn't touch. But if you're talking about, let's go back to music and culture. What I argue is, when you have home ownership, when you have good jobs, when you have higher incomes, when you have clean air, you can get the protection, you can produce the music, you can create the policies that help you to thrive. But without sort of these building blocks of power, it's going to be hard to acquire other aspects.
Yeah, I promise I'm not going to ask any questions on turning the mermaid black. But I wonder whether there is a relationship between the broader health of a community, you focusing on the Black community, the African American community, and its cultural power, its sporting power. Because, of course, in the United States, African Americans have always had a relative amount of cultural power, certainly in music.
Yeah.
Today, they have strong cultural, economic power in sports, perhaps also on social media. You've touched on that. But it hasn't always gone together with broader
Right.
community advancements. Is there perhaps sometimes a connection between the froth and the reality? And if you have too much froth, the reality somehow suffers?
Oh, absolutely. And I actually think that political parties often use the froth as indicators of progress. I mean, we certainly got a Juneteenth celebration or Juneteenth holiday, Black excellence celebrations on the White House lawn, a number of symbolic things. And, you know, we used to coin the phrase Black Twitter. The reality is that Black people did not own Twitter, and you see what happens when you don't have ownership. Now, I just want to be clear. Some of these symbolic and cultural facets of power are very important, particularly music. Music certainly in many ways serves as the soundtrack to a movement. But music without home ownership, business ownership, property ownership, clean air, you know, it's hard to convert those things in ways that actually adds years to your life. Now, I lived in New Orleans for 14 years, and it's arguably one of the cultural capitals of the world. It also has lower life expectancy. And if you're Black and if you're poor, it is one of the meanest places on earth. And highlighted in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So I'm very disciplined in this regard. I want communities to have the assets, the material stuff, and social and human capital as well. I talk a lot about education and families as well. I want all those things to be in place because too often we accept these consolation prizes of power, these symbols of power, and try to use them as if they're more substantive forms. So this book really, I mean, I don't attack a lot of people. There are some straw men I go after. But what I do say is that we need to prioritize our policies around the things that matter most on life itself. And for me, I think if you're going to define power, I'll say this: we know what through the George Floyd's death, what an absence of power looks like. So power has to do something, has something to do about living itself. And so for me, this book really builds upon that and uses data to identify the most important factors on life expectancy.
You said that the book doesn't compare the Black community with the white community, but the subtitle of the book is Measuring the Racial Gap and What We Can Do to Close It. Does the book address the fact that, according to economists like Angus Deaton, who's been on the show, his thesis with his wife, Anne Case, about the death of despair. Yeah. How does that narrative fit into your narrative about the Black Power, the current Black Power scorecard?
Well, throughout the book, I certainly highlight the policies that were really targeting Black Americans, withholding resources from Black majority communities. Now, most people know me through my work on housing devaluation, where we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about 48,000 per home.
Yeah, and that your last book, Know Your Price: Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, was focusing on that.
That's right. And so a lot of that was a result of the housing policy. I mean, Jim Crow, racism, slavery, housing policies, and others. But redlining had a tremendous impact on Black Americans in restricting the amount of wealth and intergenerational wealth transfer to generations. So I will never lose sight of that, and I certainly cite all those significant anti-Black policies throughout. Why I measure Black people to Black people, because too often we only look at Black to white and in the national aggregate, and when you do that, it really masks what progress is happening at the local level, the engagement, the activism, the agency that is really transforming people's lives. So Black people in places like the Newark, New Jersey area, in Putnam, New York, they live to 83. In Montgomery County, Maryland, they live over 80. There's places in Collier, Florida, people are living to 83. Places in the Midwest, the South. And this not by chance. There are majority Black places, white places. There are blue counties, red counties. And so if you measure everything in the aggregate, you really mask progress that's happening at the local level. So again, I think comparing Black to white is a important indicator or set of measures that we have to look at. But good research also looks at within groups and the variations across the country, and that's what this book does. And I highlight people who are actually doing great things in different places, things that can be replicated, scaled, codified, because just as redlining was a local endeavor that was eventually resourced and codified by the federal government, many of the activities that I highlight in Black Power Scorecard at the local level can be resourced and codified by the government to improve people's lives.
Maybe I didn't express the question clearly, but in books like Deaton's Death of Despair, there's a great deal of analysis and hand-wringing about the suffering now of white America, certainly rural white America, the opioid crisis, and many other consequences of deindustrialization. My question is, does that, in terms of your focus on the Black American community, does that, I mean, obviously it matters as a human being, but does it affect your Black Power Scorecard, or is that just in parallel?
One of the, I mention it, but I always show a scatter plot when I present this research of well-being. A lot of the deaths of the despair comes from the well-being research. Deaths and despair is on the lower end of well-being in terms of suffering. And what we see is that if you invest in the lowest rungs of, and whoever's in the lower wealth profiles in a community, you raise well-being for everyone. And for me, I also want this discussion around Black power to say, hey, when we invest in Black communities, many of the places where Black people are in terms of on the lower quintiles of wealth, when you invest those communities, you are actually improving the well-being of everyone. And so for me, I try to make that bridge on occasion so that we avoid the zero sum sort of battle that's going on. That if we talk about Black people, we ignore white people. But this book, it's really different. It's really saying, hey, let's look at strength. And I appreciate many of the contributions that have focused on suffering. But for Black Americans, um, we are over-indexed on talk of suffering. I actually think when you're talking about white communities, in particularly those impacted by the opioid crisis, industrial plants leaving communities, that's a relatively new narrative that's in play. But for Black Americans, we rarely hear about the strengths of community. So for me, I am, I'm focused on Black lives. That's the nature of my research. I do make methodological and statistical bridges to say that improvements and well-being of one group will improve others. But this book was really targeted on those folks who are really trying to move a Black agenda, and but in a different way, one that's focused on the assets and the strengths as opposed to focusing on what we're fighting against. And I ask that question to everyone. I know what we're fighting against. What are we fighting for? Because when you look at what we're fighting for, it's very similar to what other people are fighting for: clean environments, good housing, affordable housing, chances at home ownership, business ownership, stronger families. And by the way, I do have a conversation in the book about marriage. I think we need to talk about building stronger relationships. The difference in my work is that instead of saying marriage is a solution for poverty, I say that we need to look at the preconditions of marriage. So education, wealth, criminal justice system, because when you have healthy communities, guess what? You have healthy families. So, so again, this book is really focused on those who are interested in improving the quality of life of African Americans from a vantage point of ridding ourselves of the drags of racism that are specifically targeted to Black people.
It's, as you say, a data-filled book. Your analysis is driven by data. You're at Brookings, so that's not really much of a surprise. Are there one or two data points, Andre, that summarize your argument? Perhaps data points which are offering, as you say, less of the problem and more of the solution? What data points really stand out? Of course, the book is out today and we want everyone to read it, but what are the data points that for you somehow highlight what you're saying in the book?
Yeah, I talk a lot about investing in Black owned assets, Black majority neighborhoods, Black communities. One of the studies that my colleague Jonathan Rothwell did, that's featured in the book, we wanted to look at business quality. So we scraped all the Yelp data from businesses all across the country. We got the race of the owner. We controlled for, attended to spending power, education, and other factors, because we wanted to get an apples to apples comparison between various businesses. And what we found is that Black, brown, and Asian owned firms actually score higher on Yelp than their white counterparts, but they get less revenue in majority Black places. Now, why is that important? Because if you're getting less revenue for quality goods, you're creating perverse incentives. You rob communities of revenue. You rob the business owner of revenue, and you get less services over. But I love that study because it confirms something that my elders used to tell me all the time when talking about Black businesses. They would say, our ice is just as cold. Our ice is just as cold. And in many respects, we need to invest in Black businesses because it makes it's a good economic case. It's good for business. It's good for economic development. It's good for community development. But we often, what that study also shows is that the perception of the neighborhood is impacting the perception of the business, and that is something we need to rid ourselves of. So so that in a nutshell sort of illustrates what I'm trying to do in this book, is say, hey, look, there are quality assets in communities. There's strength even in places with low life expectancy. I'll stay on business. In Baltimore, for instance, Baltimore has lower than the average life expectancy, but when it comes to business ownership, it's high. There was a gentleman by the name of Lanier Richardson, who he's purchasing or developing moribund commercial real estate and using these SEC, Security Exchange Commission approved crowdfunding platforms to create a class of investors, people with as little as $1,000 who can invest in a development. And what he's doing is creating a whole class of new owners in a community. So and yes, these community, if someone's trying to be critical, they'll say, oh, they're not going to get a lot of dividends from this. They're not going to get a lot of payoff. But in terms of community ownership and investment and being able to patronize a set of businesses and increasing the number of owners of commercial real estate, it's invaluable. So we can look to real solutions even in places with lower life expectancy, because there's strength in every community. And you know this, how many times you've had a story about Baltimore and it was about how bad it is, and how limited it is.
Yeah, it's a very popular television show.
That's
Andre,
right.
I take all your points, and obviously the book is important, but I recently rewatched Spike Lee's 1989 movie, Do the Right Thing. And that's obviously, right, it's brilliant, a piece of drama, but he's basically pointing out the same stuff that you're talking about, the importance of Black-owned businesses and of Black dignity in terms of life and how people are treated. Your book obviously is highly sophisticated in terms of its quantification of all this stuff. But are you saying anything in Black Power Scorecard that hasn't been, and I'm not necessarily critical here, that hasn't been said many, many times over the years by activists, politicians, everybody who is focused on this question?
Well, what I actually find refreshing is that when you look at the Black Panther Party, Spike Lee, they were calling for some of the same things. And coming from the same place of, hey, we can do this. Just get the discrimination out of the way. In fact, we have a lot of great resources in our community. And so I don't think that I'll ever get tired of seeing another version of that. And in fact, I think even going way back, the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and his classic experiment, the Philadelphia Negro, he went door to door collecting the data that we can now use essentially machine learning to do. So so I certainly honor the people before me, but I do think in this time in particular, where everyone's looking out and hearing what's bad. And you certainly have government officials saying, through their using DEI as a slur to discredit Black people, to say Black people are inferior, that these practices are a sign of unworthiness. That this book comes in and say, you know what? No, we have a lot of good things going on, and we won't be fooled by this narrative because we have data to back it. That employer firms, for instance, I'll just throw out some more numbers. Black people represent about 14% of the population, but only 2.7% of employer firms. Those are firms with more than one employee. But since 2017, that number has grown by 50%. And it keeps growing because more and more entrepreneurs are figuring this out. What we lack is essentially the investment capital to grow those businesses even more. But if you believe the narratives that are out there, you would think nothing good is happening. So what I do, I mean, this is a hopeful book. It is not one of these doom, gloom, shock and awe, look how bad things are in Baltimore, St. Louis, New Orleans. No, this is actually pointing to look what's good and what's right in our communities, and how can we build upon it to actually improve the quality of life for everyone.
You mentioned just before Black Panther. I mean, the book is called Black Power Scorecard. It obviously raises the specter of the idea of Black power. There's been an ongoing debate. You mentioned Du Bois as well within the African, I don't need me to tell you this, within the African community, African American community, about how to get power politically, culturally. I guess the split between MLK and Malcolm X. Is what you're doing part of that ongoing conversation within the Black community, in your view?
Oh, absolutely. I am certainly part of the conversation. I work at the Brookings Institution, and it doesn't get past me that I'm a Black person working on Black issues in Brookings. And many people look to me as a data provider, and people across the political spectrum look to me to get a sense of what's actually happening. So I hear from progressives, from conservatives, from people who are out there marching in the streets, and people who are in elected offices. And so I'm part of the conversation. Data should be part of the conversation. And so I think the difference is I do take a very fact-based approach and to the conversation, but in a spirit of let's change things for the better. So I'm part of the conversation, a different angle. I still work on narrative change, but certainly I bring data to the table.
What do you make, Andre, of this ongoing debate now amongst progressives about not just the failure of the Democratic Party, but the challenges of regulation and improving life broadly, not just for whites and Blacks, but for all Americans? We've had shows recently where I'm sure you're familiar with Yoni Applebaum's new book, Stuck, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity, which of course focuses on your expertise of housing. Also did one with Mark Dunkelman, Why Nothing Worked, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have a new book out on abundancy, which focuses on the same thing. How does your analysis in Black Power Scorecard, how does it work with the debates and arguments being put out by guys like Dunkelman and Applebaum and Ezra Klein?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I think, and I'll also, and I speak to this in the book, I'm around sort of where the left and the right converge. One, I think the left and the right are just frustrated with the levels of bureaucracy that, in their mind, slow down progress. And that bureaucracy for the left and the right comes in the form of DEI by any other name. And I know this intimately. I was a school leader in New Orleans when the ed reform movement was in full swing, and largely progressives wanted to get rid of trade unions, district rules. They wanted to eliminate bureaucracies. You would hear them say, schools are not human resource offices, and actually they are in a lot of different ways, but that's beside the point. And on the right, they were saying the same thing. These structures are getting in the way. And I just also want to be clear, because I state this in the book. These bureaucracies, some of it are what can be categorized as DEI programs. We don't want either. We don't want set aside programs. We don't want like these special programs. We want to be mainstreamed into the capital markets and mainstream institutions. But guess what? Discrimination is real. We see it every day. So when people try to sort of skirt that or get frustrated by that, guess who gets hurt by it the most? And then, but even also in my book that I'm also very clear about, there is a fascination with the billionaire class that Black people are also affected by. You most often see it in rappers or who are, promote certain viewpoints on capitalism, and I address that head on. And so, and I quote in the book, I quote the Jay-Z line who says, "What's better than one billionaire?" He asks itself. Then he says, "Two, especially if they're the same hue as you." And I go, well, I mean, that makes little sense because it's all about the means of production. If you, on your way, particularly in the music industry, support an artist at the expense of giving dozens of, or not giving dozens of, or health care, fair wages, burdening them with these horrible record deals and contracts, clearly that's not good for the masses. In addition, I mean, we would never say what's better than one Black slave owner, two, especially the same as you. No, we would never say that. That it makes no sense. So for me, I'm also clear that we need to be focused on median wealth, if anything, not on the tail end, which lends itself to a whole series of policies that abandons middle class and working class people. So I think my book fits into this new range of writings about how to focus on regular people and get progress in housing and education and all these other things. But I'm different in this regard. I am very clear that you're not going to remove these bureaucracies and expect racism to go away. That these things are there for a reason. In addition, we do need to focus on working class people, but often even that conversation is to assume working class is white. When we envision middle America, for instance, we don't think of the residents of Ferguson. So for me, this book is different to say, hey, let's focus on the median wealth of Black people, and let's look at solutions for them, but also just very acknowledging that we live with discrimination, and we need to have guardrails for those phenomena.
Your book focuses, Andre, again, don't need me to tell you this, on the issue of power. You're challenging the reader to rethink what true power means. The book is a blueprint for building collective power. But of course, like any community, the Black community in America is divided. It's divided demographically in terms of old and young people, like any other community, and also between male and female. There's been a lot of debate about men voting for Trump, Black men voting for Trump. How do these divisions play out on the Black Power scorecard? Do you acknowledge them? Are they important, or are they distractions?
I think they're important, but I do address them somewhat in the marriage chapter, because if you look at the number of blogs and podcasts and books and films that are essentially pitting Black men against Black women, it's unreal. And this is where I do believe it is a distraction, that when you control for wealth, relationships are just fine. And so Black men and Black women should have an interest in addressing sexism, addressing the criminal justice system, addressing broken educational system. We to pit men and women against each other on, particularly on party lines, makes little sense to me. That obviously you can vote differently. You can your vote isn't wedded to your gender, and certainly not to any particular party. But what I am concerned about is that we don't see ourselves as part of a community. So the research itself looks at Black people at a community level, because those systems that negatively impact Black people, both men and women, sometimes differently, they are still generally coming from the same systems. So educational systems manifest themselves differently for Black men and Black women, boys and girls. The employment sector, criminal justice, but they are impacting the community as a whole. So for me, I try my best to say, look, these gender wars, we certainly have to look at the differences in education in men and women. We certainly have to look at the pay differences between men and women. But from my viewpoint, we see systems at the 30,000 foot level that are in fact impacting both groups, but just differently. So my goal is to work on these larger systems and structures, instead of having these bespoke sort of approaches to both genders.
You've been very generous with your time, Andre. One final question. Speaking of those larger structural issues, in the Dunkelman book, he talks about there being two traditions in progressive America: the Jeffersonian one, where reform comes from below, and the Hamiltonian one, where reform comes from above. You had an interesting piece on Selma, where social divides can come locally. I began the show by talking about the Doge cuts and the assault on the traditional American state, the bureaucracy in DC where you live. As a final question, it's a big question, but I'm looking for a relatively brief answer. Is Black Power Scorecard really in that Jeffersonian tradition of suggesting that reform comes from below, from within communities, especially Black communities, and that African Americans or any minorities should rely less on the state, less on the Hamiltonian structures in Washington, D.C., and more on their own local organizations?
No, I think I'm much more of a structural Hamiltonian type of approach, but I also just understand that the solutions are coming from the local level, and certainly there must be organizing and mobilizing within groups at the local level. But I also am clear that if federal and state governments as well as corporations aren't part of the solution, it's going to be hard to create the kind of change we want. So for me, Black people are tax-paying for the most part, tax-paying citizens. Not to say that that's the only criteria for participation in this, but I really do believe that we deserve benefits from federal, state, local governments like everyone else. And so I don't necessarily say like we have to do this on our own. We have to fight the man and pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. No, we should get what we deserve because we're American at every different level, and we should demand from our systems to respond appropriately.
That's good stuff from Andre Perry. The book is out today, Black Power Scorecard, Measuring the Racial Gap and What We Can Do to Close It. Important argument, optimistic and progressive at the same time, a breath of fresh air, given how miserable most people seem to be, particularly on the left in America in April 2025. Andre, congratulations on the book. We'll get you back on the show. Still a lot more to talk about. Thank you so much.
Yes. Take care.